Welcome everyone to ReggieCon, the con that asks the question, hey, what's your story? I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty. I'm a cognitive scientist here at Illinois State University. And tonight we come together to celebrate Women's History Month with a discussion of the award-winning graphic novel, something I've used in many classes, Sita's Ramayana, with author Samhita Arni. Joining me in tonight's discussion is a friend, colleague, an alum of ISU back from a conference in South Korea, Miss Maisha Orthy. Maisha, please come on in. Tell the audience a little something about who you are and why you love graphic novels.
Okay, can everybody hear me first?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Maisha Orthy, and I actually lost count how many times I've appeared in ReggieCon at this point, but it's always great to be back here. I'm currently doing my PhD. I'm a second year PhD student in cognitive science at University of Utah, and I am a little jet lagged, as Scott mentioned. I just came back from South Korea from a conference, but I love graphic novels a lot. I call myself a pop culture nerd because I kind of delve into most pop culture stuff that includes anime, movies, games, and like graphic novels and everything in between. So one of the reasons I personally like graphic novels is because I like how it's a great form of storytelling that you could use pictures and like a narrative through the pictures, and you can also tell a lot of things through that. And another thing, graphic novels also is a very unique way of tackling a lot of different societal and political issues, which, I mean, graphic novels, when people think about graphic novels, they think about it's a very lighthearted medium. But you can actually use that lighthearted medium to kind of tell a lot of difficult topics in a much more like simple way, and that can be digestible and palatable for a lot of people. So that's one of the many reasons that I enjoy graphic novels and talk about graphic novels.
Excellent. Well, it's good to see you again as always, and thanks for joining us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest, the author of Sita's Ramayana, award-winning author, Samhita Arni. Samhita, please come in, open your mic, open your camera, and tell us a little something about who you are and why you love graphic novels.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Scott, and lovely to meet you here as well, Maisha. And thank you, whoever's listening and logged in. I'm a writer based in Bangalore. I work with graphic novels, but I also work a little bit in the film industry. So kind of one of those portfolio careers, but I keep writing. And one of the things I do is retell Indian myth and really work with retelling Indian myth in the context of today, in a way that resonates with audiences of today. What keeps me passionate is because I think a lot of women's voices and women's traditions have been kind of excluded from the way that we interpret mythology. And mythology has almost, in India at least, becomes this way that we should live our lives, very prescriptive. So bringing back these perspectives that often challenge and provoke the way that mythology is interpreted, for me it gives me a great sense of purpose. And I find the graphic novel medium wonderful because it is, although it developed so much from cinema, in India at least, one of the dichotomies we face, one of the binaries that has existed in our literature, in our literary traditions, is literature that has been written in text has been highly venerated, placed on a pedestal because it's written by text. Often those were written by upper caste Brahmanical men. So text comes with a certain capital, a certain kind of politics, narratives in text. Oral narratives, visual narratives often are written by people who did not have access to those systems of text. And often, so sometimes they represent a very subversive and different point of view. So I feel the graphic novel in that way can kind of play with that and challenge that. And in an Indian context, kind of with Sita's Ramayana, we are really descending from that lineage of oral visual storytellers who did provoke the status quo. So that's what really excites me to work with graphic novels. It breaks me also out of the hierarchy of text. It makes visual imagery much more important than text in some respects when we're working. So it plays with a lot of those notions, those structures.
No, that's fantastic. So glad you agreed to be with us this evening. I've used this text in at least 5 classes. Maisha was on a panel in the spring of 2024 about Sita's Ramayana with about 5 or 6 people, open to the public. And one thing I want to comment on before we start is this sort of theme you spoke of, Samhita, about the patriarchy being baked into the cake in the infrastructure. And I think it's an important thing, and it's an important thing about these kind of systems for people to have these moments of conscious awareness of what they're living in. Because when you get raised in it, it's like a fish being raised in water. They don't know what water is. We don't know what, I mean, we just breathe it, we live it. We don't know it, right? We take it for granted that way. And I want to give a real concrete example because I want to ground this. A colleague of mine was talking to me today about going to a department store. It's Kohl's. It's a department store. And noticing that at the far right of the store, it was a women's clothing space. And then next to that was a children's clothing space. And then next to that was another women's clothing space. And then on the far of that, completely removed from the children's space, was the men's space. And she had never noticed that before. And embedded within the structure of the store are these, what I'll call, othering systems. These systems that clearly make it clear who's to be where, and those sorts of things. And one thing we'll do tonight is have maybe some of my students will ask questions. I have some students here, but one of the things we talk about in the class where I use this is getting students to look at reality, getting them to look at what they live in as a multi-scale system of otherings, and the idea that all living systems necessarily create boundaries from the single cell organism all the way up to the cosmos, all the way up to the culture, and then recognizing these boundaries and not seeing them as evil, but understanding who they're keeping in, who they're keeping out, and then asking yourself if you can live with that, right? And that's a different way of framing these issues, and I appreciate your text bringing those things to light. So what the first thing I'm going to do is, you said a little bit about why you wrote this graphic novel. The question I have is, I'm just a huge fan of the creative process, maybe if we tag creative myself. What were the obstacles you encountered? What was the work involved from having the idea of this thing to actually having it come to fruition?
So it was a very collaborative graphic novel, and I think it's interesting because we call me an author, and we presume that the author is the primary driver of a creative process.
Yeah.
And this for me was a real collaboration with my publisher, who I'd worked with before, Tara Books. They knew that I was obsessed with the Ramayana, and I was thinking of working with it. I produced another book called The Missing Queen, which is a thriller novel, and that I was working and really engaged with the multiple versions of the Ramayana. And they knew Moina, who had worked with them on other projects before, and they spoke to me, and had heard of the Patua Ramayana in my research. So then it was just, they came together as that bridge to make this happen. So in many, and it was really a collaborative process. There was a lot of back and forth. The challenge was, Moina lives in in Bengal, and I live in Bangalore. She doesn't speak English. This is my primary language, and a lot of the conversation was almost completely facilitated by our publisher. So she would send, and of course, you see these Patua paintings, they're these giant scrolls that I think must be, like 30, 35 feet long, and each Patua artist makes them every generation, and they carry them with them, and they go from village to village, and they unroll the scroll, and they point to what's happening, and they sing to tell that story. And now we have to translate it into a graphic novel format, which doesn't allow, which is still kind of linear, right? You want to prioritize one perspective. If you're telling a story night after night, you can change perspectives. You can be oral. You can jump from one character to another, which you can't do so easily in a book form. So not only did we have to adapt the image to the text, and she had to redraw everything on kind of paper, and then we had to figure out sequencing and things like that. We had to also stay consistent. So the Patua Ramayana starts with Sita, but at some point another narrative will come in and another narrative will come in. So we had to really figure out a way to make those connections make logic for a reader, not lose that reader, especially since we were aiming this as something that could be read by a younger person. Um, and that is important because I think that's where the biggest change and the biggest impact can happen. That moment. So, that was important to us. The other real challenge was, I think, working with the tech, designing the whole book in a way that the text complements the image. The text itself kind of plays a character sometimes. The way that the designer has laid it out, sometimes, the words are pointing to a particular thing. The words themselves in one place turn into weapons that are kind of attacking this character. And so to really make the text a little bit more agentic and not just make it panel, panel, panel.
Oh, that's fantastic. Have you had any pushback on this text? Can you give us some examples? Because during the presentation here at ISU, there was actually, as Maisha will remember, some pushback. Wait a minute, those stories have been told in my family for years. The women don't complain about the Ramayana. What are you talking about, right? So what kind of pushback have you received?
So when the book got a lot of attention in India because it did so well. I mean, it was on the New York Times bestseller list, and then every paper in India wanted to write about it, so it became really a big thing. And I would get these emails and messages and tweets, particularly from men who were like, have you thought about this? And this is not right. You should be killed for this. Things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, things like that. I mean, the thing is, they've grown up in this world, and in that world they've grown up in, they're the privileged ones, right? And they just consider that these kind of things as violations of that status quo. And one thing about people that are in power that wrap themselves in narratives is they're usually virtuous, right? And I call it, dissonance to virtue. I mean, they know that they're exploiting and excluding other people, but in order to feel good about it, they wrap up their exclusionary practices in some kind of virtuous narrative. I'm trying to find the truth, or we were divinely selected, or all these sorts of things that gaslight themselves and keep them from having to recognize the suffering that their sort of othering is generating. Maisha, do you want to chime in on anything we're saying?
Yeah, I wanted to I'm an international student in the US and I grew up in Bangladesh, and I speak Bengali very fluently, and I have grew up with this. I'm not religious, or I didn't grow up with this particular religion, but I read this story since I was I don't know, second grade or third grade. I watched the Ramayana, the Japanese anime movie, and I read the book. I read Mahabharata and stuff like that. So these was very close to my heart because I like mythology a lot. And when Scott suggested this book for a class and we were reading it, it was such a fresh breath of air for me, because it always bugged me the wrong way how it was never really told from Sita's perspective or the perspective from the women in the Ramayana, because there's so many characters there, so many female characters there that also go through so much, but all the popular textbooks that's on Ramayana are from the male's perspective, from Ram's perspective, or from or at least the ones that I've read so far. So it was amazing. So I really loved it. And as Scott mentioned during the presentation or the discussion of Ramayana, there are a lot of pushback from men mostly, and I'm just gonna be very explicit. And they were talking about yeah, it's good that is talking about from Sita's perspective, and yeah, it talked about those things, but this is not actually what happened. This is the main thing. So we got a lot of question about that, and Dr. Gurpyari, she was also trying to explain these things to everyone, that this is not like talking more about the book and stuff like that. So I kind of, when Scott asked that question, I was like, yeah, like this is that's a very relevant question here. I just wanted to know like I mean, as someone who grew up in a very conservative country, I was just wondering like what that did you, as you already mentioned, you got like death threats and stuff like that. What kind of like thought process went into your head when you like thought about writing a book, from writing this graphic novel, or thinking about writing this book? And like I know like you know that you were going to get a lot of pushback, but what made you like pursue this process through that?
I think it has to be done. Um, yeah, I knew that my own relationship with the Ramayana was a very fractured one. The Mahabharata, which is the other great Indian epic, was something that I was much closer to growing up. To me, it seemed much more real because it is about conflict between families and these questions of right and wrong and good and bad. And there's a certain level of compassion in the text, even for people who are technically on the wrong side. So the text has a lot more ambiguity and possibilities of subversion in it. The Ramayana was always told to me in this way that this is how you must be. This is the story of good versus evil. This is the story of what it means to be an ideal man. This is what it means to be an ideal woman and wife. And you step out of these boundaries. If you are not like Sita, and if you are like Surpanaka and you express desire, then it's a real problem. It limits you if you're kind of, you grow up with that story. And so I just didn't like it because, first of all, I wasn't particularly keen on having my identity entirely circumscribed by marriage, and that too sort of self-sacrificing wife in marriage. What happens to Sita at the end is, I mean, to me, it's the story of the first divorce. It's an epic divorce or an epic
Yes.
separation.
Well said.
And it was a struggle for me to make sense of it, that this is the fate that women should set themselves up for. And when I grew older and I came across, suddenly I was just, when I was 22, I'd come back to India after being in the US for 4 years for college. And I remember reading A.K. Ramanujan's 300 Ramayanas. And that essay also got a huge amount of flack. It was banned. There were protests because he talked about some of the ways that there are multiple Ramayanas, and I just suddenly, things just came together for me. And that the fact that there were these oral traditions that women had tried telling the Ramayanas, that a lot of women 4 centuries ago, 5 centuries ago, 6 centuries ago had exactly the same issues that I had with the Ramayana today. I suddenly felt a lot less alone. I had grown up feeling alone because of my difference to the epic. And suddenly I was like, no, I mean, this is sensible that I have these questions. Other people 6 centuries, other women 6 centuries ago have had these questions. And then I felt it had to be told. We had whitewashed our own cultural heritage. We had become more patriarchal than less. So I think that our society in some ways has regressed. And I think that is the uncomfortable truth. I wanted to bring it back into consciousness because I think myth is a way that a culture expresses its story that conditions us. And what has happened before is every generation has retold myth in a way that aligns with their reality and their circumstances and their contexts. I think we have to keep doing that for our culture to remain continuous, but also to be able to adapt to the current world and what, as humanity, we're evolving into.
I very much like your comment about regression, right? And the question I have is, when you say things like that, do you find yourself motivated by experiences, for example, in the United States, women having more power in the workspace, women having more control over reproduction, and it's these challenges to the patriarchy that actually gets members to double down. In other words, do you see the regression related to a sort of increase in complexity that some can't handle, and they sort of regress? I'm just curious if you've had thoughts on these lines.
Oh yeah. I mean, I definitely think regression is a reaction prompted by fear towards complexity. Definitely. I think regression also has a lot to do with power. Who gets to be in power? So whether the patriarchal epic is allows men and certain castes not just men, but
Yeah,
also
exactly.
where you are in a caste hierarchy to remain in power. In the Ramayana, you have that episode where Shambhuka, who is a Shudra or a Dalit, as you might identify, different texts identify him differently, but he's killed because he tries to step out of his prescribed caste dharma, his prescribed occupation. And even though there is a sense of tragedy about his death, he's still killed to preserve order in the kingdom.
So I'm going to go just a wee tad left here. Samhita, I'm going to ask you, are you a fan of One Piece at all?
It's One Piece.
One Piece is a manga anime. So I was just asked because I was going to ask if it's okay if I refer to you as a pirate, but that requires...
You can call me a pirate.
Okay. But everything we're talking about here, we're also talking about complex systems a lot. And the thing about talking about complex systems is, yes, they do give rise to emergent order, but that emergent order will die if it makes itself stagnant, right? If it doesn't embody the context it has to survive in. And I think that's a reasonable frame to sort of bring to the issues you're mentioning and some of the issues we're going through globally right now. Systems are not adapting to the context in which they are existing, and they're trying to make everything be their way to sustain their way of life. And we're yet to see what comes of all this, but I think complex systems is a decent way to think about them. Okay. Samhita, I have a little bit of a treat for you. I'm using your book in my class, and what we do in this class is I ask people to pick a frame, a page or a frame. And one of the things we teach in the class is what I call multi-scale othering. You referred to this earlier, and one of the things you can do with a graphic page in a graphic novel that you really can't do in text, I mean, you can, but it takes a lot of words, is to create the nested scales of relational tension that you can get in an image that you can get with text, but you have to write it all out, right? You have to, whereas in the image, it's just right there. So I ask my students to look for picture frames and talk about how they contain multi-scale othering. So what I want to do is share one with you, and then I'll read what the student wrote about it. And then I'd like to get your reaction. This also happens to be my favorite image from the book. So can you all see that? I hit share. This is Sita in the Fire. Everybody can see that? Because my screen's kind of, okay. Yeah. So I'm going to read to you what a student wrote about this. It says, it is the page during her ordeal by fire, and she's surrounded and engulfed in flames. While as a frame itself, it seems simple, the message and example of othering is really powerful. Sita was finally free and war was over. For a second, she thought her troubles were gone, but then she suspected of infidelity. And in order to prove herself, she must go through this trial by fire. After everything she had gone through, everything she had struggled through, to be met by accusations and distrust must have felt unbearable. The trial was unjust, and yet she sits in the fire untouched and unfazed, and the complete othering between her and the fire, showing that not an ounce of flame touching her is such a powerful frame. I was hoping I could get your reactions to that. As a student on target?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Maisha, you have any reactions to that?
I think I graded that paper. I don't remember it if I was one of someone who was grading the paper, but like this is one of my favorite panel too. I have another favorite panel I can talk about in a little bit, but like this is one of my favorite panels because it kind of also depicts it's kind of like also gives you a physical border with the fire. Like I don't know how was your thought process of it, how you communicated with the artist with this, but I just like, even if you don't have the text, you kind of see that physical border, and it also it itself gives you the impression like what's happening in the picture and like how we are like defining Sita here. So like I was just wondering like it's just a question, like how did you communicate your thought process with the artist and like what you wanted from this panel?
Oh no, I didn't. It's her idea. I just found words to explain it. The visuals are the primary form of narrative. It's not the writer coming first here. It's the image maker. So she had drawn this, and I had to figure out a text to work with it.
Oh, fantastic.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. This is also, if I'm not mistaken, the only page of art that has what I'll call such a high spatial frequency in terms of the stripes alternating in color so quickly in the visual image. So that frame itself sort of others itself from the rest of the book in terms of this one is really, really intense and transformative because of that spatial frequency. I'm going to go ahead and ask if anyone has any questions, please just go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll take questions and take it from there. I don't. Oh, hold on. Sean Costello has a question. Is there another story epic that you would like to do something similar to what you did with Ramayana, in the sense of presenting from another perspective that usually doesn't have a voice?
There are many, but I think the problem is time, money, support to enable
Yes.
these things to happen. At the time that I wrote this, I was looking after a very sick grandmother, so my rent was being paid, so I could manage
There you go.
all the
Well,
right. If but there one of the epics that has been sort of really possessing me for the last couple of years, and I keep returning to, and maybe sometime at some point in my life when I become incredibly wealthy and have lots of free time, this is my big hope. Is I want to work with the Shilapatikaram. I've already written one text on it. It's called The Prince. It's historical fiction that's based on the author of the Shilapatikaram. But and then there's a sister epic to that same text called the Manimekalai. These are things that come out of South India around the turn of the 2nd century AD. And what's very interesting is that they challenge this kind of Indo-European idea of what the hero's journey in the mythic structure is. Um, because, typically, whether you're talking about the Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey or even the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, these are stories of princes who go to war, defeat enemies. That's the typical setup for it. That's the line that runs across all of those stories. But the Shilapatikaram and the Manimekalai are about women who come from kind of middle class, ordinary backgrounds, who challenge the might of kings. And because of their anger, because of the challenge they present, society breaks down, or the king is killed, or things are destroyed. And they are really stories of rebellion and social revolution and social justice. And I think they're quite powerful because they really invert this alignment of king, war, conflict, enemy, and turn it into more justice, rebellion, outcry, and really locate it in a female character. And then, as you get more deeply into this, you discover that a lot of Buddhist narratives, Buddhist and Jain narratives in India, seem to privilege women being the center stage of action, women being the heroes of the story. Again, that's something that's not highly known. So that is something that I'd really like to bring out in a graphic novel format someday. The other story that I think has been, I'm also very much interested in, I'm working right now on my own kind of graphic retelling of this, which comes from Indian folklore. So a couple of Indian folk tales that really talk about, that don't explicitly state why women are so repressed. It doesn't say this is how it happens and this is what happens, but the story itself gives you that flavor. I can tell one of these stories if anyone is interested. And should I?
Yes,
Please do,
I would
yes.
love to know.
Okay. And they're very short. They're small, short stories. So there is one story of a woman who's sleeping one day, and for a long time, this woman had had a story and a song trapped inside of her, and but she just felt like she couldn't tell it to anyone. No, maybe there would be nobody to tell it to, or that creative act itself. Sometimes you have to take a risk in telling a story and a song that is sort of sitting within you. So she doesn't tell it to anyone, and the story and the song are sitting within her, and they're getting more and more frustrated. They're coming to full term, and they're not being let out. And so one day when she is falling asleep, they see their chance of escape because she's sleeping with her mouth open. So they jump out of her, and they transform into a coat and a pair of shoes, and they just lie there in her house. And then her husband comes home, and he sees this coat and pair of shoes, and immediately he becomes suspicious. Has there been someone here? Has a man come and visited my wife while I'm away? And obviously you can imagine all of the questions that result from that. And so he wakes his wife up and he said, "Who was here? What man have you been talking to?" And the wife is like, "No, nobody. I was just sleeping here. Nothing happened." And he's like, "No, look at this. Go look at these shoes. Who they belong to?" And she's like, "I don't know who they are. Who they belong to. No." And so then he goes off. He's really angry. He storms out of the house. He says, "I'm not sleeping here." And he goes to the temple and he unrolls his mat in the temple and he decides to go to sleep. And then at night, now it's the custom in this village that each house has its light, has its lamp, and then at night people put out their lamps. So all the lamp flames, now that they're put out, they go into the temple and they gossip about what's happened in the course of the day. And they come there, and the man can't sleep because he hears all these voices, and he looks up and he sees these temple flames gossiping. And then finally one flame, one light comes a little later than everybody else. And everyone's like, what? Every other flame is like, "Why are you so late?" They said, "In my house, the woman, she went to sleep very late. She was crying and crying." Why was she crying? Oh, because she had this fight with her husband. And the reason she had the fight with her husband was because, he saw this shirt and this coat and these pair of shoes, and he thought somebody had come to visit her. But no, actually the coat and the pair of shoes were the story and the song that have been suppressed inside of her for so long, and they felt very angry towards her, so they decided they wanted to take revenge. And this is what happened. So the man hears it and he realizes his wife had been telling him the truth, and he rushes back home and makes peace with her, and they are happily united. And then he asks her, "What was the story? What was the song you wanted to sing?" And she can't remember. And I love that story because it's the ambiguity of that ending, the happiness and the sadness, the happiness that the couple has come back together, the sadness that this woman has suppressed herself, and will. And that also is the tension on what her relationship is dependent on. So, yeah.
And you're making a graphic story about this? I look forward to it. Thank you for that, by the way. It was a delightful story. I appreciate you telling us. Doris Houston asks, how do the visual elements of this novel communicate emotion, power, and resistance in ways that are different than text alone?
Yeah, I think first of all, using the Patua tradition, which the Patuas themselves, the Chitrakas, they're coming from a system that they're considered Dalit by the way we organize castes today, but they're really not part of this mainstream, what we call the Varna system. They exist at the margins of it, and Chitrakars can be Muslim, they can be Jain, they can be Buddhist. There are differences in that community itself, and so they themselves, but they're Chitrakars. They make images. Chitra is image, and so there is a tension in them, they themselves being the carriers of this lineage. They're not operating within the caste system. They come from this, how at the margins things mix and coalesce in different ways. They come from that marginal identity. So that is one aspect of how their visuals, like for example, Sita, you can see here is a very dark Sita. In most mainstream versions in India, Sita is always portrayed as very fair-skinned, which is a beauty standard that's very linked to the caste system, very linked to the way the system has been established, the beauty notions of the system. So that is also one way that it challenges it, that you see a Sita that looks like the person who created the image. So there are I mean, those are just to give you two examples of how it resists it. Design-wise, we wanted to disrupt certain things. So you can see there's a moment where there's a spread where we have Sita and Ravana next to each other, and Sita is trapped in what is Ashokavana. She's been kidnapped by Ravana. She's been held there in prison. So we kind of barred her image, sort of make her seem like she's been jailed. But in that image next to her, we show Ravana the same way. So he's trapped by his desire. She's trapped in other ways. So they're both kind of constrained. So to pull out the similarity between those characters also creates a different way of seeing the story. Moina did this, and this is something that's quite interesting. There's a moment when Ram goes off to find the golden deer. Sita is left in the cottage that they have in the forest, and she's by herself. And what Moina has done is literally draw bars over her face to again bring out that prison imagery. So those are various, I mean, ways that the text is sort of, the images have kind of rebelled against conventional readings.
That's fantastic. Maisha, did you have a frame you wanted to share?
Yeah, I don't have the photo with me, but I can explain. I had the book opened when I was like looking at it, but like I wanted to say one thing first before that. I wanted to point it out at some point like that. I love that how the Sita is dark skinned, and instead of the fair skinned Sita that I have always encountered when I was growing up in all the visual medium of Ramayana. So I really glad you did that, and the artist who did the painting. It's such a, like a, how do I say it? It's such a strong commentary on the whole South Asian diaspora, on like how beauty standards are seen there, and like how it is always like, oh, fairness cream advertising and stuff like that. Like the more you have fair skin, the more privilege you have, some sort of bias towards it and stuff like that. So I think it was beautiful. So thank you for that. One of the thing I loved about this book is that I loved how you and the artist incorporated the thoughts about like other creatures, other living beings in the story. Like I remember the panel that I was trying to mention is that where the fishes in the sea are talking, that like how the Rama's like actions are affecting them. So Ram is going on a war with Ravana, and like all these things are happening, but it is not just them that are getting affected, but it's also the other living creatures in the world that are getting affected. Ram's like they're begging the god to stop the war, and also stop the war that's affecting the water, and that's affecting their livelihood and stuff like that. It just feels like very distinct from other versions of Ramayana that I've read, is because like I don't think any of them like talked about this particular aspect, that like how just the war doesn't really affect just those people, but rather that everything around us gets affected by it, even though didn't have anything to do with it, but they are also getting affected. So that's like one of my favorite frames from the book, because that was beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think we're sort of living through that today. In India, we have a gas crisis right now, and all if you are coming from a privileged place in society, which I do, there are other ways of, as we say, managing these things. But if I'm talking to the woman who comes and works for me, the security guard who guards the building downstairs, and they're really struggling for a war they don't understand.
Yeah.
So let me follow up on Maisha's comment about giving the voice to nature. Because I'm not familiar with the Ramayana itself, is that not part of how the Ramayana is presented? Is it pretty much the human-centered story? And if you gave voice to nature, what was the reason behind that?
So in many ways, you could make an argument that the Ramayana does give a voice to nature. If you look at the Valmiki Ramayana, which is the canonical Ramayana, as we call it, it begins with this wonderful episode where Valmiki is wandering he's a sage, a rishi, he lives in the forest, he meditates, and he's wandering from his hermitage to the river. And on the way there, he sees these two birds who are in love with each other and engaged in the act of mating. And they're very beautiful, like these golden colored birds. And a hunter comes, and while they're mating with each other, he shoots one. He shoots the male and kills it.
Mm.
And as the male falls to the ground, the female bird is crying piteously, heartbroken, obviously. And it's the sound of that stays with Valmiki. He curses the hunter right then and there, and he says, "What have you done? How could you have done that?" And the hunter goes away. And then Valmiki is left, and the sound of that bird's grief stays with him, stays with him, stays with him. And it turns, the word in Sanskrit for grief is soka. And then the sound of the grief of the bird had a kind of a rhythm to it. And that informs Valmiki, that stays in Valmiki's mind, giving impetus to this poem. He's like, what poem can I have that fits this rhythm, that expresses? And he decides to fit the Ramayana poem into that. And he soka, and then the meter, the sound of the bird's grief, the rhythm of the bird's grief, shloka. So you really see there the form evolving out of emotion. And I think in that way, there is an aspect of nature and the text and creativity and everything coming together. Of course, you have also in the Ramayana this whole idea that when Ram goes over to Lanka, nature is on his side.
Yeah.
The animals of the forest come along with him and become part of his army. So there is that kind of sense. But what we did in Sita's Ramayana was something also that came that was quite interesting. I don't know if you see the first image. It's Sita weeping, and she's surrounded by the forest, by plants and trees. And what's really striking about that image is when Moina drew it, she drew the plants with faces. So immediately when they sent me the image, I was like, oh my God, the plants are a character in the story, and we have to weave them in there here. And to me, suddenly triggered all of these thoughts. Yes, Sita is the daughter of the earth. The earth, these trees in this forest are saying to her, we're related to each other. All of that occurred to me in my mind. And it's, Sita coming to the forest is like returning to earth. And I was starting to play with that as a narrative frame, because in Indian epics, there's always a storyteller and there's always an audience. And, every epic is told by a storyteller to an audience, and both have a kind of a connection to the story itself. And I thought, okay, yeah, we can reintroduce this kind of convention into this. And then later on, when the book came out and I was meeting Moina for the first time, she was like, I didn't know I was drawing plants with faces. And I had gone off created this whole thing on it.
Yeah,
But it was there for her subconsciously. Yeah.
Yeah. When I saw that first image, for me, it framed the novel as somewhat of a Gaia story, a Gaia myth, in the sense that Mother Earth is capable of giving life while men are not capable of giving life. And what does that power mean? And what does that mean when that power is suppressed? And the fact that, how the story ends came across to me as to, Mother Earth finding herself, realigning herself with all of her power instead of just the one that the world allowed. So, yeah, I very much resonated with the vines and faces and things like that.
As you say that, something else occurs to me. And I've been thinking about this recently for a while. It didn't exist in my mind when I was creating Sita's Ramayana, but now when you know how a story stays with you. I mean, even though
Right.
I've produced this book, the story will stay with me for the rest of my life. We talk about the hero's journey, we talk about the hero myth, Joseph Campbell, etc., especially when we're talking about storytelling. But, Maureen Murdoch, Joseph Campbell's student, produced the heroine's journey. And Sita's is very much a heroine's journey, but it's an incomplete one. Because there is that stage in the heroine's journey where there is grief and there is descent, and then there is reunion or reuniting with the mother. And I think that's how the Ramayana ends. After that, in Maureen Murdoch's in the cycle she developed, there is the integration of masculine and feminine, the healing of the wounded masculine, the return to the world. We don't see that upward trajectory, but I think it also reflects civilizationally where we are. sometimes. The fact that our myths have not progressed
Mm.
to complete the cycle says something about where the culture I live in is stuck.
I think that's fascinating. And I honestly think the 21st century is what I'll call the century of holism. And I think that these things that you're talking about are coming to be. We will come to grips with the true nature of these powers, or they will take us over. And I mean, it'll be that clear. And I think this is the century where that gets sorted out. Sorry, but I say these kind of things in class all the time because, yeah.
Good.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Maisha, did you have anything you wanted to add at the moment?
I don't really have any particular question, but I was just wondering, like, as we have talked about, like, mythology and like Iliad and Odyssey and Mahabharata and all this, like, different types of myths. And as someone who likes mythology a lot, and I've read most of it, and like, I was just like, there are a lot of similarities between like both like Indian subcontinent myth with the Western myths and stuff like that. Like even the Greek myths or the Norse mythology, there's a lot of similarities with these things. But I personally, I feel like the most of the Indian mythology have like more collectivist type of storytelling in it. Like the family is important, like fighting for the family is important. Like to put it very simply, those are the type of things are like really prevalent in this type of story. And yeah, gods are important, but gods are not the main thing that's like playing a role in this. As far as I remember, Mahabharata, like even in that scenario, it's like gods are there, but they are not pulling the strings. But in terms of the Greek mythology, it's the gods who are pulling the strings. So I was just wondering, like, how do you think about this, like different types of mythology, and like how do you have any plan in the future to like bring like more Indian subcontinent myths and stories in the forefront, like Western forefront, or to like talk more about? I know you've mentioned like translating some of the stories from India to like in a graphic novel, but do you have any other plans of like building from the other mythologies into the scenario, if that made any sense?
No, thank you for that. And I think it's what you're pointing to is so interesting also. The differences between mythologies, there are similarities, but there are also differences, and those differences really speak to the cultures that create them and that are perpetuated by the telling of the story.
Yeah.
In many ways, what you're absolutely right, this sense of duty to family, which is so significant in both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. This is still the glue of the joint family system today in India. So we live these epics, so we live the value systems that are embodied by these epics very much, and that's very true. Yes, like there is an individualistic tension versus a slightly more collectivist kind of perspective. I've also been thinking so much because I'm kind of obsessed with K-dramas. I don't know if anybody else here is, but I
know of them.
I watch K-dramas, yeah.
And I'm just been thinking about how much the structure of K-drama really challenges what I was taught about narrative structure, because as I sort of been going deeper into it, the conflict is used like when I was studying in the US, I was studying in a film program, we were told conflict is the heart of the story. Conflict. And K-dramas, conflict is definitely there, but it's not the driving engine of the story. I don't know how to explain it. It's used as a narrative tool to keep people engaged and interested in the story, but it's not the heart of the story. And I'm thinking, like, for example, last night I was watching the latest K-drama to be released, which is Phantom Lawyer. And it's not, and it's very interesting, but it's not, the characters may find themselves on opposite sides, but it really, the moment that the perspective shifts, they are no longer bound by conflict. It's about a perspective shifting that brings them together. And I think that's so interesting for me to think as a writer, because I think maybe sometimes focusing on conflict, focusing on stories of princes who have to go to forests to fight demons or fight their family, does that program us in some ways to want to be heroes and replicate their acts? And so if we change the story a little bit and we say, hey, there's a moment where there's a shift will happen and the two of you who are on opposite sides will become more aligned, can that create more possibilities for how we encounter the world? So that is a different frame of storytelling that I'm very interested in, and seeing how I can incorporate it in the ways we tell stories today. And I want to actually return to the Mahabharata at some point, because there is an aspect of that there. The Indian approach to narrative, the Indic, what has evolved in India as an approach to narrative is very much the frame story. It's the story within a story. So both the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, we talk about the Panchatantra, these are all frame stories, smaller episodes, and they're linked by a larger frame, and the frame is the storyteller and the relationship between the storyteller and the audience. And I find that so interesting because the frame is like these nested dolls, one story underneath another. Mahabharata is very much that. And we see that narrative form travel west. And when it travels west, it goes to the Middle East, and it seems to result in what's something that does this even more radically, which is the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, story of Scheherazade and the Sultan, where again, storyteller, audience, both are being changed by the story. And you have the frame narrative where she's telling a different story every night, but the story is told in a way to change the audience and transform that king who was this tyrant before into someone who is loving and does not just kill women every night. And I think that's also quite profound. It speaks to the power of stories to change. It also speaks to the frame narrative's purpose in educating. All of these narratives, are the productive of patronage. And so as a result of patronage, they're geared towards the royal courts, and the job there of the storyteller in some ways is to educate, prepare, develop leadership in that king. And the frame story offers multiple perspectives, perhaps offers the young prince to be multiple perspectives on his society.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it's my my deep pleasure to introduce colleague and friend Dr. Gurpyari Bhatnagar. Gurpyari, please open your mic, say hello, tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning here in India and evening in the US. Hi, I'm Gurpyari Bhatnagar, Associate Professor of English Literature at Shahid University. The largely theoretical frameworks interest me, and that's the reason I've been and my students have been using Professor Jordan's theory, wild systems theory, to look at literature. So lately you've been exploring wild systems theory to look at Mahabharata, because I was listening to Samhita Arni. So yes, Mahabharata, Ramayana, so these epics really interest me and my students. The academic association with Professor Jordan, dates back to 2018, where we had met at the Science of Consciousness conference at the University of Arizona. And then in 2021, Professor Jordan was invited at the inaugural conference, as the inaugural speaker at the conference at Shahid University. So that was a virtual conference that we had organized. And the following year, we had invited Professor Jordan to write a foreword for us. So for our book, Literature and Transdisciplinarity, so that's an edited volume. So yes, so it's a pleasure, to be invited in this panel, and especially Samhita Arni. So it's I'm really looking forward to this discussion with you. So with the author who's written this work, the work that I discuss with my students in the classroom setting. And it's a pleasure to meet Maisha again. So hi, Maisha. Yeah.
Yeah, in the spring of 2024, I was able to invite Dr. Bhatnagar to come to Illinois State University for a few days, and she graced us with her expertise, and it was a wonderful experience. She was actually on the panel discussion of Sita's Ramayana that I mentioned earlier, so this is kind of a getting together again, as it were, of people on that panel. So, Gurpyari, if I may, what is it about this book that gets you to desire to use it in classes?
It's a Sita, as a character, has always fascinated me. So for the very reason, how Sita has been perceived by audience, and when I say audience, I actually include my students here. So interestingly, an overwhelming number of students conceive Sita as an archetype of ideal wife. And so recurring adjectives, that have still been used, to describe Sita, have been, she's very devoted, she's very loyal, very obedient, self-sacrificing. So most of these students, have not just inherited the story, but an interpretation which has been extremely, value laden. So which they have formed either through oral tradition at home, or this could be, oversimplified narratives, that must have been discussed in the classroom at the school level. And then it's all the more painful, when a large number of students believe that, Sita is submissive, Sita is passive, weak, somebody, who does not have an agency, somebody who does not have a mind of her own. And therefore, while, had these students known the original Valmiki Ramayana, so their interpretation of Sita would have been extremely different, would have been, very, very broad. Because, we as instructors, know Sita, has made, very deliberate choices, whether it is to accompany Ram to the forest, when he was exiled for 14 years, or, when she refuses to go through Agni Pariksha, the fire ordeal the second time, or, when she decides, not to unite with Ram toward the end of the text. And therefore, it is significant for us, as instructors in the classroom, to introduce the kind of narratives which allow them space to form their own interpretations. The interpretations which are not colored, interpretations which are not unilateral, right? So interpretations, which are not biased, not selective, but interpretations which help Sita, which help us to look at Sita in its entirety, and not just Sita in its entirety, but also the gender constructs, in their entirety. So I knew, Valmiki Ramayana would be a little difficult, for my students at the undergraduate level, and it is when, we decided to have Samhita Arni's text, the graphic text, for our students. As part of my research-based learning sessions at the undergraduate level. And it was when, I had introduced, this particular text to Scott's students as well. Yeah.
Any reactions to Gurpyari's comments?
Thank you so much for using this text. I'm really grateful that you use it with your students, and thank you so much for doing that. And absolutely whatever you were saying about that script, that cultural script of Sita, submissive, passive, that's exactly on some levels to write this was to counter some aspect of that. I also, when you were talking, the word Janam Dukhi kept coming to mind. We call Sita Janam Dukhi, the one born to suffer, and that also speaks to how we create this idealized woman who's born to suffer. That is exactly what patriarchy sort of birthed here. And Yeah, just one thing I would say is that I'm one of the creators of this book. Moina is definitely, I mean, in some ways, she's more of the author of it than I am. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any further questions from the audience? Okay. Well, Samhita, how about you? Do you have any questions for us?
Yes, Jordan, because I'm so interested about this, Scott, because I'm so interested about this intersection between systems thinking
Yeah.
and mythology and societies, and also because it's very close to how I can see the parallels with the way I'm also thinking of the role that these stories play in the world.
Yes.
So I wanted to get a sense of how that shapes your view of literature. And I
Oh
know
my
that's such a
goodness.
vast question, but
No, it's
yeah.
fantastic. I mean, if you look at all living systems as energy transformers, right, that necessarily intake, transform, and dissipate energy, part of what they have to do to stay a system is a boundary has to come from their work. So the chemical reactions going on inside a single organism, single cell organ, give rise to the cell membrane. But that cell membrane it's a permeable border. It allows some of context in and it keeps some of context out. And the reason I focus on those things is because it naturally and necessarily embeds all life in the energy transformation dynamics of the cosmos. I don't mean to sound like Carl Sagan, but it seems like sometimes we tell ourselves stories about what we are that disconnect us from what we're in. And what I try to teach my two students is that they are in, of, from, and about everything. And life is a matter of managing how much of everything you're about. And that means developing wisdom that lets you select more sophisticated boundaries, because we can't be what we are without boundaries. So most people, the character phenomena like the Ramayana, they are cultural tools that help sustain certain types of boundaries. They teach them to their kids. They get before their kids are of the age where they can actually cognitively counter the argument. The countering usually comes from very precocious children or, adults later. But they're pretty helpless when it comes to embodying these narratives. And so I want students to understand that they are living a whole life of implicit narratives. And my body has a narrative about gravity. And if my body doesn't use that narrative about gravity, I can't walk, right? So I'm not saying implicit narratives are bad. They're a necessary condition of being. But the challenge is to bring the opportunity we have is to bring some of our narratives to consciousness. And it's in that space of conscious possibility where then we can organize our work to perhaps transform. I'm not so much concerned about transforming people's minds that are my age, but transforming the context within which younger people develop, because they're going to embody these narratives implicitly just because their parents and their families do it, and that's what they celebrate. And they don't know that they're embodying it, right? So being aware of the stories you've embodied and then asking yourself, do you respect them? Do you respect yourself for respecting them? From a systems perspective, I tend not to spend a lot of time on extreme things such as right and wrong, because I think those are extreme fixed points that are not adaptable and they're not aligned with the dynamics of reality. I rather ask people, and poor Maisha, she's heard this so many times, but do you respect the boundaries that you keep? And what I think people will find is they live a life that helps more people expand and understand their own boundaries. They actually respect their own boundaries even more. So it may reduce to Buddhism, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But the issue is to get Western thinking out of this mental, physical binary that people can sit on and then generate all kinds of wonderful stories about divinity, absolute truth, these things that have been used to marginalize people for quite a long time. So narratives are what I'll call cognitive pheromones, right there. The things we put into the world that constrain how other minds develop. And we're going to embody them. That's just what we are. So, try to develop some kung fu so you can make a choice about what kind of narratives you embody. So thank you for the question. I don't often get asked that during ReggieCon, but it was a delight to be able to answer it. And it has been the absolute scholarly human thrill to collaborate with a literature scholar, and bring these kind of things to bear. And, I'm teaching a senior seminar in college using graphic novels. And Sita's Ramayana allows my students to practice seeing the world in terms of boundaries, the dynamic tensions across a page. Those are boundaries, right? And then what kind of boundaries are your neural networks developing to put them in a configuration related to that? And then what kind of boundaries are you creating with the world so you can actually sit and read the book and not get hit by a car, right? So just trying to get people to know that we are multi-scale systems of boundaries. That's not a sin. That's what we are. And then how do we develop boundaries that we respect? I think that's what it's all about.
It's so interesting that you say that, Scott, because one of the things I did in the last couple of years was I retrained as a psychotherapist and then as an organizational psychologist. And in an organizational psychologist, we're constantly thinking about what is the unconscious of a system? What is the unconscious in this group? What is the consciousness in this room? Why are we replicating certain behaviors that don't lead us towards success or towards the goals that have been communally chosen? And when you were speaking, one of the struggles for me has been, on one level, I am this writer and I have this divided identity, and my day job is being an organizational psychologist and working with CEOs.
Right.
Yet there is a similarity between these things because the narrative shapes that culture. I think what I was also getting from that is that, and the moment that we reframe the narrative, the system can align to a new perspective or can incorporate a new perspective. And that is how we evolve. Because there is this other tension. There are definite problems in some of these stories that we have inherited, and yet they are part of our human heritage. I don't want to throw them out. I don't want to say, let's create a new story. Yes, let's create new stories, but let's also keep these. And how do we keep them in ways that are still alive, but allow us to expand? Because I think that's also how we maintain a kind of cultural identity. And I feel it limits to have a cultural identity, but I'm also so grateful to have one, even if I am the challenger and the rebel within that. So I think it was interesting to think about what you were saying in terms of culture, because cultural identity too is a system. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really try to make sure people understand that identity is a boundary, right? It's there. It's who or what's going to be allowed in and who or what's going to be kept out. And that if you can't generate those boundaries, then you can't tell what's you and what's not you. And then we end up diagnosing you as schizophrenic. So cultures that don't have a tradition do risk anarchy, right? I mean, like tradition or not, it gives us an implicit sense of what we're supposed to be doing. Now, the beauty of us, the human system, is that we can challenge it. One of the challenges I see in my culture right now is the binary extremes are dominating both sides of the narrative so that it reduces into good and evil. And the complexity of the discussion simply vanishes, right? And all that old stuff is just so dumb. Well, no, it's not, because that way of thinking had a place in history. Right? It sustained itself. We may not like that it sustained itself, but it did. And, as we go to transform the system that we're in, the question is, are we generating options that are sustainable? And what that means and can we examine it? So, yes, everything we do plays out at the intersection of choice and chance every moment of our lives. And that's a story. So getting students to experience themselves, getting cultures to experience themselves as stories instead of binary extremes is what some of us thought democracy might be about, I'll stop there. I don't want to, Lord have mercy. It's a hard time to be interested in these things. It's a hard time for a lot of people in the world, given what's taking place these days. So I'll stop there. Maisha, Gurpyari, comments, questions? You want to change direction? Please go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So the Microsoft business framework is altogether new to me. So I'm a little confused here with switching on my mic and then Okay,
sorry
I'm so
about
sorry.
that.
So yes. So to answer to respond to you, Samhita, when you said, how's it that we, are looking, at systems theory, how's it that systems theory, looks at, works of literature. So very true. One of very important, components is that it actually makes us look at binaries with lot of empathy, right? So for instance, so if I again, go back to my students, how's it that they have been conditioned, in this culture, how's it that they have been conditioned to perceive, Ram Sita binary. But then, for instance, if we go to take a look at Sita Pillai's work, the text, where we have the radical, representation of Sita, especially in terms of, how, Sita has been represented, in those, musical sequences, where we have, where we have, hints at her sensuality. And then, there have been very exaggerated, gestures. The equally exaggerated, are her, body designs. And therefore, that's a sharp contrast, that has been presented, in, this particular text. Contrast to the kind of traditional perception or the traditional iconography that students have always seen in the calendars or the idols in the temples, for instance. And therefore the way Sita has been depicted, the way Ram has been depicted. So here we have both Sita and Ram as extremely emotionally constrained characters. But then, this particular text gives altogether a new representation to the two characters and the gender constructs. So this particular theoretical framework has actually allowed us to look at, the binary of Sita with more empathy. How is it that we're going to, look at the two? How is it that the boundaries, have been created? How is it that you're going to look at, those boundaries? And if, disruption, has been created, to a certain extent through the representation of, these binaries and diluting these binaries. So that actually, allows our students, space to respect, those boundaries. So that's, one idea that has actually helped me and my students to look at, texts like these. So, the very perception, to look at, those texts, has been, more liberating, has been more fluid now. So that's one advantage, of this theoretical framework that has come down to us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I keep thinking of Ken Wilber's framework as I'm hearing all of you speak, and I don't know if it sounds like you're familiar with that, but that evolution of consciousness as well, we see that mirrored in the kind of narratives, that movement from different levels of thinking, and we are moving. And I was thinking, as you were saying, about more able to respect those boundaries, that is the movement into that integral consciousness, where we're able to see the context in which a story has been created, respect it,
right,
and also understand that we want something different now.
Yeah, true.
That is such an important, dare I say, development, because one thing that is often accompanies but that was dumb, that should have never happened, is it's a complete misunderstanding of the fact that we're all developing the narratives we can right now. We're all working in the stories and the imaginations that we can generate right now. And 20 years from now, 30 years from now, our imaginations are going to look dumb. But they're only going to look dumb in relation to that context. Not, so as the context keeps changing, and my God, who knows what we're going to be talking about in 20 years with AI running things, right? Who knows what narrative is even going to be when computers can generate them a hell of a lot faster than we can. I mean, we have no idea. So the systems that we generate are to keep groups together and to keep things moving over the next 20 years. They're not going to be what we're talking now. And being able to see oneself as part of a system in motion, I think, is just somewhat liberating. I do also think that it's cognitively taxing to have to constantly experience yourself struggling for stability in a system in motion. And to be honest, I'm not sure cultures survived because everybody in the culture was interested in experiencing themselves as a system in a motion. And the idea of fixed points of belief actually probably made cultures very powerful, as large amounts of people with fixed beliefs were able to be led to terraform the planet in ways they couldn't have if they were all out there seeking self-discovery. So it's that kind of insight that I work on personally. I try to work on with my students, and I do think it's 21st century. I do think that's where I do think. Well, I'm just gonna say I think 21st century is a century of holism, where we collectively become aware that we're all part of the same thing, and we're all here from and in of about it. And we can't escape. There is no other place to go. There may be another planet, there may be another solar system, but there's not another reality to go to. So, all right, on that boring Scott talking note, I'll go ahead and start to bring things to a close. Maisha, you have anything else you'd like to say before we check out?
I was hearing about this whole systems talk, and Scott knows I'm a systems enthusiast, but my type of system, like what I study in my PhD, is like comes more from like data quantitative perspective and non-linearity of data, and how things are just like not just like causal relationship, rather like everything is like connected to each other, and like one thing can affect another thing, but that variable can affect the first variable too, and all those like more boring stuff. So that's what I was thinking more from that perspective. And I was thinking how graphic novels has the ability to express those narratives in such simple way. And like I love how Samhita has like portrayed the whole concept of those systems living in through the Sita's Ramayana and her other works. And yeah, I really liked that part of the book, and like that part of graphic novels in general as a storytelling perspective. Yeah, like I don't think I have much more things to say about it, because I am a big fan of this book and a big fan of this work, and I am looking for. It was like absolutely. I was really happy when Scott invited me to be part of this panel, because I really wanted to talk to you, and like I'm really great to see Gurpyari, Dr. Gurpyari too in this panel again. So it was an amazing experience, and I'm really looking forward to your future works, and like really excited to see like what you bless us with next. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maisha.
Yeah. Gurpyari, any final words?
Yeah. So, why this particular work is very, very close to my heart, because, for the reason, for the set of emotions, that this particular work has generated. So if you take a look at Sita, for instance, most of the frames that we look at, where, we have teary-eyed, Sita that has been depicted. But then, there is one frame where, Sita actually expresses anger. And for that, I really, love this work. Why? Because I mean, it's always, Goddess Kali or that has been associated with anger. So this is how, she has been represented. But for the first time ever, that I have, taken a look at this particular work where this particular rasa, has been generated in me, when I, look at this particular character. Otherwise, largely it has been, the rasa of sorrow, compassion. So Rodra, that we say, rasa of Rodra, sorrow, compassion. But for the for the first time, Karuna. So Karuna, that's the rasa, that's the rasa of Karuna, compassion, sorrow. But for the first time, it was rasa of Rodra, that anger. So which has always been associated with Lakshmana, in the mainstream narratives. It's the first time that that I've seen with Sita. So I just love this work for doing this to me. The kind of rasas that this particular work has generated to me. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, I really appreciate you saying what you just said, Gurpyari. My partner and I often talk about the extent to which women are or are not raised and developed and coached how to do anger.
Yeah.
Right. And, as a guy, I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't at first, I had to be educated, right, what that meant. But it's absolutely the case. Right. And anger is a valid human emotion. So, how do we enculturate people to be able to express it in healthy ways and useful ways, and instead of suppressing it? So I appreciate you, and I'm glad that you found. I'm glad you found that cool, because I did too. So, Samhita, any final comments, words of wisdom?
No words of wisdom, but thank you all so much for having me here. It's been such a rich conversation. I love this, talking about literature, how it impacts us more widely than what we read, how it forms us and our societies and the systems we live in. So that has been very rich to think about this in context with. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for being here. It's been a fantastic celebration of Women's History Day. Thanks to everyone behind the scenes for making us look like we know what we're doing, and thanks to all the other audience members who showed up and asked questions. So until next time, have a good evening or have a great day. Bye-bye.